Good morning for us in Pacific time. Good afternoon for those in Mountain time. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on recent pinyon-juniper responses to climate change. We have two speakers that will each present for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions and discussion. The first talk is Great Basin pinyon-juniper responses to climate change, Woodland expansion, contraction, or transformation, presented by Peter Weisberg with the University of Nevada in Reno. The second talk is Pinyonjuniper woodland management changes after 2 decades of drought, perspectives from the four corners, presented by Ian Barrett with the Bureau of Land Management. Tomorrow's Pinyonjuniper webinar has talks on fire impacts, recovery and restoration, and anticipating future climate-driven changes. So if you aren't already signed up for those and would like to be, please visit greatbasinfirescience.org. And I believe Corey is going to put the link into the chat. Also regarding the chat, so we're using Zoom webinar rather than Zoom meeting, and so that means attendees can't see attendees, unfortunately. So if you'd like, please enter your name and affiliation in the chat for a better sense of community on the webinar. But if you're going to do that, before you do that, please go to the 2 drop-down arrow in your chat to change the audience of your message from panelists to panelists and everyone. We will also be using the chat for questions, so please type in your questions at any time and I will field them to the speakers after the presentations. Now I'd like to welcome our presenters. Peter Weisberg is a professor of landscape ecology at the University of Nevada, Reno. Using field studies, dendrochronology, greenhouse experiments, GIS, remote sensing, geospatial analysis, and ecological modeling, he studies the causes and consequences of landscape change, including climate shifts, fire-climate vegetation interactions, tree line dynamics, grazing effects, and invasive species. He works to improve the understanding of landscape dynamics and to apply this understanding in support of sound natural resource management. His presentation today includes 2 important co-authors, Tom Dilts and Sam Flake, that won't be presenting today, but will be acknowledged at the start of the presentation. Ian Barrett is a fuels program lead with the Bureau of Land Management, Colorado State Office. He has worked in the Four Corners region of the Colorado Plateau for the last 6 years on various fuels management projects, including mastication and thinning. He has experience with pinyon-juniper woodland dieback in this area and how it affects understory response and management decisions. Welcome, Peter and Ian, and thank you for presenting today.
Thanks for that intro, Janie. Let me share my screen. Great. Well, it's not, I can't see everybody, so, but it's great that everybody's here. Can you all see that?
Yes,
so,
that's great.
So as was mentioned, I have 2 co-authors, Tom Dilts, who's a research scientist here with me in the NRES department at UNR, who was the lead on most of the remote sensing work that I'll present here. And I'm also going to present work from a field study, which was the core of the master's thesis of Sam Flake a few years back, well, more than a few years back, I guess, because Sam is now a postdoc already at North Carolina State. So the background here in my title slide shows a patch of pinyon-juniper woodland that most people would probably look at that and say, there's an expansion woodland. We have lots of different age classes and size classes of mostly young trees. There's still kind of a balance of tree dominance and dominance of shrubs and grasses, and you can see there's even some cheatgrass in there. This photo was taken in 2011 at Carroll Summit in the Desitoya Mountains in central Nevada at about 7,500 foot elevation. If you were to look around there, you would see that there's a lot of logs with char and signs of historical fire, probably a 19th century fire. So we're looking at a long-term process of very protracted post-fire recovery that's now leading to this filling in of woodland and a dramatic change in vegetation structure and ecological process. Like I said, that photo was taken in 2011. In 2016, another fire swept through, and now that landscape is totally transformed. So let's see if I can advance to my second slide. There we go. So this slide, I apologize for the amount of words on it, but This is kind of my take-home message, which I'm presenting early in the talk. So if you fall asleep for the rest of the talk, or go get coffee or do something else, while you're waiting for the next speaker, I at least want to make this point. I want this to sink in, which is the need for a long-term perspective. So a perspective that matches maybe the lifespan of this 800-year-old single-leaf pinyon pine that we're looking at in the photo. So a perspective that considers woodland expansion and contraction as complementary processes over the long term at the landscape scale. So the balance of tree cover on the landscape at any one time is going to reflect the historical legacy of climate change, disturbance, and human influences. So we see in many of our Great Basin landscapes that in the absence of disturbance, and with much of the landscape in a young to mature stage of woodland development, we see existing tree canopies that are growing and new trees that are establishing. And why is much of our landscape in this young to mature stage of woodland development? Well, based on limited fire history studies for the region, fires were frequent in the 19th century Great Basin through about the 1960s. Tree harvesting for charcoal and for other uses was pervasive and widespread from the 1860s through the 1880s. So tree cover would have been much reduced during that time. Following that time, from the late 1800s to the early 1900s and beyond, the combination of overgrazing that denuded much of the landscape and greatly reduced fine fuels, leading in part to a relative absence of fire. And that, combined with a favorable climate for tree regeneration, created the conditions for rapid woodland reforestation and expansion that we've been observing in these landscapes for many decades now. So on the one hand, we have those processes we can call them processes of expansion if we want. On the other hand, we have processes of contraction resulting from recent drought mortality events, increased in wildfire frequency and intensity, and tree removal treatments too that are increasing in intensity. And these processes, as I said, are complementary, and importantly, they're happening at different rates in different environmental settings, in different places on the landscape. So I pose here with my talk that a forward-thinking land management would anticipate pinyon and juniper distributional shifts as we're moving into the future, which, to simplify things a bit much, which might include a loss of tree cover in the drier and hotter areas and a gain of tree cover in the wetter and cooler areas. Though, of course, it's never that simple. So that's the underlying premise for my talk. So it should be obvious now that I'm talking about pinyon juniper woodlands, and I'm going to focus my presentation on pinyon juniper woodlands of the Great Basin that are dominated by single leaf pinyon pine, whose range is shown with these these green vertical line polygons on this map, and Utah juniper. So this Great Basin pinyon juniper woodlands, you could see that the range is nicely centered here in the state of Nevada, but also spans into western Utah, goes down to the Mojave Desert in places, and southeastern California. And pinyon juniper woodlands in general cover over 100 million acres across 9 states in the western United States. And I guess you wouldn't be tuning into this webinar if you weren't already aware that this was an important vegetation type whose management really matters. So, as I mentioned, the recent historical context has been one of conifers expanding, or in many cases reforesting. It's a matter of time scale largely, into adjacent rangeland vegetation types. And in the panel on the right, this time series of rephotography that is evident, where in 1901, very few trees, sage steppe vegetation. By 2004, it's a closed canopy pinyon juniper woodland with little evidence of understory vegetation. And there's many, many examples and many photo pairs that we've looked at from different presentations on this topic. The management response to this has mainly been large-scale tree removals from over much of the Great Basin. So here we're looking from Spruce Mountain down into the valley that's just west of Spruce Mountain. And we could see from the pattern of patches of leaf trees how extensive the tree removals have been in that area. flip side of the expansion process, as I mentioned, is the possibility of large-scale pinyon-juniper die-off associated in many cases with hot drought events, which has been observed in the Four Corners, Colorado Plateau region, and much of the southwestern US. So this figure is from a paper from Meddens et al. 2015, which maps out areas of very intense pinyon-juniper mortality, sometimes getting up to almost 100% of the canopy cover, which are the red patches in this map. In the Great Basin, we haven't yet seen patches of mortality as extensive as what can be observed down in that region, but we're starting to see an increased rate of mortality patches. So a question for my talk is recent woodland decline balancing historical woodland expansion in the Great Basin? I'm going to show quickly some results from a remote sensing study, a field resampling study, pose the questions, where is decline occurring? Where is expansion still occurring? And briefly touch on what happens next after overstory decline. Does it all become sheetgrass or Methuselah head or other invasive annual grasses? Does the sagebrush steppe vegetation reestablish itself within a short time frame? So starting with the remote sensing study. So our study was regionally limited to portions of the Western Great Basin. We used LiDAR data that we had for the West Walker River, the East Walker River, and Porter Canyon and the Desert to very precisely map tree canopy cover within those study areas. And then we scaled up from that to Landsat imagery using random forest regression tree models to model the fractional tree cover in each 30-meter Landsat pixel over about over a 33-year time frame from 1984 to 2016. So having that time series of canopy cover in each of those Landsat pixels, we were able to map out areas with significantly positive trends of change, negative trends of change, and neutral patterns where there's an inconsistent or inconsistently changing or constant pattern of tree canopy cover over time. And this was limited to areas that were in pinyon-juniper woodlands. We masked out other vegetation types that had trees. So this map shows the areas of gain, which we can think of as expansion areas, or else just areas of infilling canopies in blue. And the losses that aren't associated with fire or management are in red. Areas that burned are brown. Really, it would have been better probably to have red as the burned color, but anyway. And areas with losses due to management treatments are in purple. So if we look at this map, we can pick certain areas where we might find the expected pattern of losses from the drier lower elevations in red, so the east-facing slope of the Sweetwater Mountains, for example, and gains in tree canopy cover at upper elevations in blue in that area. We also see that if we look at the Wasatch Range. On the other hand, if we look at other parts of this image, like in the Shoshone Mountains, the west side of the Shoshones has increases in tree canopy cover throughout, but including at low elevations, where there's trees expanding down into the valley there. We see a similar pattern in the Northern Paradise. So there's a bit of variability here, but within a given aspect of a mountain range, there's some consistency. And we could see patches of burned areas and Bodie Hills, in the East Walker, big burn patch in the Desatoyas that I just mentioned, and areas of active management, particularly in the Sweetwaters and elsewhere. And again, this is just through 2016, so not including the last 5 years. What we found over this period was that pinyon-juniper losses were less than gains overall, so 9% versus 13% across our whole study area. But that losses outweighed gains in the driest landscape settings, and gains greatly outweighed the losses in the more mesic parts of the landscape. So of those losses, of that 9%, 19% of those were from fire, 10% from management, 71%, it's almost 3/4 from other factors, which include senescence, herbivory, and to a large degree, drought mortality. So gains were concentrated on north-facing slopes, sites with lower water deficits. So those are wetter sites. So water deficit, climatic water deficit is a measure of how much water vegetation would have transpired due to climatic forcing if the water had been there. So it's basically the lack of water that vegetation could have used. That's not a very technical explanation, but that's how I like to think of it at least. So higher values of water deficit, like you see in this graph on the top left, indicate drier conditions. And under those conditions, the red bars are greater than the green bars. So the losses are greater than the gains in these relative frequency histograms. Under wetter conditions, that's where you see more gains and less losses. The pattern is striking if you look at changes in tree cover versus slope aspect, where on the north-facing slopes, we see a lot of gain, and on the south-facing slopes, we see very little gain in tree cover, where the loss is relatively constant across aspects. So we found, so in a nutshell, more gains than losses still over that 30-year period, but partitioned in different parts of the landscape in ways that you might expect if these tree species, single-leaf pinyon pine and Utah juniper, were responding to climate change. So I want to point out a more recent remote sensing study that was published last year that reported on changes in pinyon juniper woodlands for the entire Great Basin for a slightly shorter time period from 2000 to 2016. And they found on average increases in woodland biomass in Great Basin pinyon juniper. So their biomass is probably most comparable to our fine scale canopy cover estimates. So they found increases of 0.2%, 0.21% per year, mostly as infilling of existing woodland, which is comparable to what we found. Our 4% over 33 years would be on average 0.12% a year. So we're at least within the same order of magnitude. We only considered a smaller study area here in the Western Great Basin. So just more recent work that helps to put our results there in context. They didn't report a comparative analysis of where there were increases versus decreases. And I believe I saw that Stephen Filippelli is in the audience. So, okay, that's our remote sensing study. I also want to present some results from a field study where initially we located over 200 plots, 212 permanent plots in the Northern Great Basin in 11 different mountain ranges, all on BLM land. I forgot to acknowledge my funders in the beginning, but they include the Forest Service, Rocky Mountain Research Station, USDA, Nevada Ag Experiment Station, and the BLM. The BLM's funding role in this project was to fund this study. The initial stage of the study where we established those plots in 2005. Those were established with my master's student at the time, Dave Greenwood. In 2015, with my master's student, Sam Flake, resampled 100 of those permanent plots. So at each of the plots, we marked every tree, we took a bunch of measurements, we GPSed it, we had understory plots where we sampled tree regeneration and understory vegetation. And we also quantified the incidence of different tree pests and pathogens. So we quantified tree mortality, and we asked how that was affected by the site environment, so climate variables and soils variables, and how it was affected by stand structure, since we had all that detailed information on stand structure from mapping every tree. So our plots were randomly sampled across this large region, across the 11 mountain ranges, which span from the Desatoyas on the west side to the Sulphur Springs Range on the east side, from about Highway 50, a little bit south of it, to I-80. So we stratified our sample to encompass different elevational strata and also different densities of woodland. So that we were able to sample areas of sparse woodland and areas of dense woodland. So the sparser woodland tended to be more patchy, the denser woodland maybe a more even distribution, more continuous closed canopy. We mapped, marked, sampled over 5,500 trees for this analysis. So the results that we found from the field study, we found a striking level of mortality in pinyon pine, much larger than we'd expected to find. Much of that mortality so we measured mortality in two different ways. So one was stem mortality, dead trees. How many dead trees did we find? There we found almost 11% mortality. We also measured mortality as canopy loss. So we compared the green canopy cover in 2005 to the green canopy cover in 2015. And we had 23% canopy loss. So I meant to point this out when I showed you this other slide, showing the photo from 2005 and 2015. You can see here that not many of the trees have died in this photo, if any, but that the canopies are much thinner. So here you can see through these canopies and see the valley below. And here the canopies are denser. So for juniper, we found much less mortality, less than 1% stem mortality, but still a pretty high level of canopy loss, 10%. In general, in 2015, there was more defoliation than outright loss of trees due to bark beetles like the pinyon ips and graver beetle. So we had defoliators like needle scale, pinyon sawfly, twig beetle, all affecting the trees in the stand, the trees in the study. So we found that there was a pretty strong relationship with our climate variables. So tree dieback and mortality were well predicted by climate variables, with dramatic declines on the drier sites, paralleling what we found in our remote sensing study. So pinyon pine dieback. So on these plots, the y-axis refers to the change in crown. So negative changes in crown refer to dieback, and positive changes, which we didn't see too much of, would be increases in canopy cover. And the x-axis, for the case of pinyon pine, refers to water deficit. So higher values mean drier conditions. So we had a strong linear negative relationship where more water deficit, drier conditions meant greater loss of green canopy and pinyon pine. For juniper, the better predictor was maximum summer temperature, as opposed to our water deficit, which is more a measure of local water balance. And that might have something to do with the single leaf pinyon pine being an isohydric species. That's more of a drought avoider. It shuts down when it's dry. And juniper being more of an anisohydric species, so more of a drought resistor. So in addition to the climate variables, stand characteristics affected the probability of canopy dieback. So this plot shows bootstrapped estimates of the distributions of our coefficients from our generalized linear mixed model, so from a statistical model, where pinyon is shown in blue, juniper in whatever color that is, pinkish, orangish, orange, I guess, where the distribution of values is to the left side of this vertical line at the 0 line. That means that that variable was associated with more die-off, and where it's on the right side of the line, it means it was associated with less die-off. So we found that in general, pinyon pine had more canopy dieback than juniper, which I told you already. We also found that dieback was more likely for larger trees, but for tall, and it was more likely for larger diameter trees of both pinyon and juniper, but more likely for taller juniper, but for shorter pinyon. Wait, that always confuses me. I think I got that right. We also found an interaction term in our model between a measure that we had of local stand density. So because we had all the trees mapped, we could calculate the basal area of other pinyon and juniper trees within 4 meters of each focal tree. So that was a measure of local stand density, this basal area and 4 meters variable. That interacted with climatic water deficit such that we found that dieback was more likely in denser patches, but only on the drier sites. And we didn't find a similar pattern on the wetter sites. So stand density matters, but especially on sites that are more water limited, which makes sense. So to summarize that, more sites that were more susceptible to drought mortality included sites with more pinyons as opposed to junipers, drier sites, sites with more large diameter trees, sites with deeper soil, and sites with a greater stand density measured in higher basal area, and trees that were closer together, more closely spaced trees. So how am I doing on time? I think I'm okay. Well, Okay, so I'll go a little quicker. So what happens after overstory tree mortality or canopy dieback? Does the sagebrush steppe vegetation return, as you see in this photo, with a lot of sagebrush and Great Basin wild rye? We found that, so this is showing the mean change in live canopy on the x-axis again, with more negative values, meaning more drastic declines in canopy cover, so more dieback. On the y-axis, we're showing understory cover for cheatgrass in the green, and for 3 different functional groups of vegetation: perennial bunch grasses, perennial forbs, and shrub species, all lumped up together in one functional group. So we found that on the wetter sites, left here, we tended to see native shrub species recolonizing the understory with a lesser response of perennial forbs. On the driest sites, we tended to see more perennial grass recolonization, well, perennial grass establishment in areas that had experienced overstory mortality. On the dry sites, we also saw in some cases a cheatgrass response, so which we didn't see on the wet sites. So the good news, on the wet sites, shrubs come back. On the dry sites, perennial bunch grasses are coming back. The bad news, we get some cheatgrass coming back on the drier sites. So the potential for the understory to become dominated by invasive weeds is greater on the drier sites, but a lot of the plots didn't look like this, and we had bunch grasses and shrubs coming back. So my takeaway messages, since I think I've used up all my time, I'll leave this slide up there. We have to think of woodland decline and expansion as complementary processes requiring a long-term perspective in these dryland ecosystems. And we see dieback and expansion happening in different parts of the landscape, not completely predictably, but with a definite pattern that you can detect depending on site productivity and climate. We can expect in the future, given climate change scenarios, more dieback in core woodland areas of pinyon, likely to favor juniper. The understory response is influenced by site productivity and moisture conditions, and management is needed that is forward-thinking, maintains the resilience of woodland ecosystems to drought and disturbance. It might include silviculture for enhancing drought resilience, especially in the denser stands and vulnerable sites. In sites where dieback is somewhat inevitable, steering vegetation transitions towards desired native understory species and away from invasive species. Facilitating tree regeneration and reforestation, especially of pinyon pine, which is the more vulnerable. And finally, you've all heard this before, but it's worth repeating that we still have much to learn. So we need to be humble, and we need to practice adaptive management so that we can learn more. So thanks for your time. If anybody wants to contact me for follow-ups, I'd love to interact with you. And I believe, as Janie said earlier, that we're taking questions at the end of both presentations. And probably I've used up more time than was my allotted, so there's no time for questions now.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, we'll you can type in your questions now, but we'll save them for after both presentations. So yeah, welcome Ian Barrett. He has experience dealing with Pinyonjuniper dieback and how that affects management. So if you want to share your screen, Ian.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good midday. So as was said, I work for the BLM. I'm recently moved to the Colorado State office. I've spent the last 6 years in the Four Corners as the field specialist for Trace Rios Field Office and Canyons the Ancients National Monument. My background is I'm a practitioner. You know, I've got a bachelor's in forestry from Colorado State, but then have been really in the field, either running a chainsaw or implementing fields work for my career. And my hope, I like how Peter gave an overview, but my hope with my brief time here is to just give more of a dashboard perspective into what it's like to be a practitioner. And then I'd also like to hopefully excite and call all the researchers out there, which I see a ton on this call, to keep feeding us information and advice on how we move forward. Especially funding wise, we're seeing a lot of additional funding coming into the federal land management agencies, and we're starved for guidance, particularly in pinyon juniper woodlands. So please keep up the great work. So this is our landscape. It's actually a picture of Hovenweep, which is just on the west side of Canis Nations National Monument. A little bit of mortality in there, but not a ton. Sorry guys, if I can advance this. So the area in focus, this is Four Corners, Tres Rios is the yellow landscape on the west side of the slide. It's about 675,000 acres. The predominant fuel type or vegetation type, I should say, is Pinyonjuniper. It's over 65%. So here's just a overview of what vegetation we've got and about where I'll be describing. So we're going to focus on this western side of the slide. That's the bulk landmass of the office, and that's bordering Utah and is the far edge of the Colorado Plateau there. So, you know what I think is interesting about the area is it is the fringe. So any changes observed here are likely you know, indicators of shift. So I just pulled this slide out yesterday, and it's showing just the drought monitor of what the last 20 years have really looked like. Peter had a great slide of that pinyon mortality seen in the early 2000s. So right around 2003, we had heavy pinyon mortality, 90% or more. You know, and we've seen decent recruitment since then. So that's encouraging. I think what's alarming, particularly in terms of management, is just seeing these intense droughts. You know, at least on this snapshot of 20 years, the frequency is increasing, and you know, we don't have as much of you know, various species left in certain areas to recruit from. So the other thing I just want to point out is you know, National Fire Plan and cohesive strategy. There are quite a few funding initiatives and then management directives that come down, you know, following these really dry periods, which also are very active fire seasons. And typically there's funding for proactive work, you know, preceding these events. So similar to 2003, we're seeing a large influx of funding into the BLM to do proactive work, which is exciting. And I think it creates an opportunity for us to hopefully push some treatment out there and have some good research going on with it to keep evolving what adaptive management looks like. So, you know, from the field, right now we're seeing small patches, predominantly pinyon pine. You know, clusters generally less than 50 acres. I think there are areas I've seen up to 200, but mostly smaller areas. And then we've had strong native grass and forb response. The photos right by Dolores, and you can see that it right now it's not really alarming. But we'll see what the future brings. I mean, we're still in a drought. The 2018 drought brought larger patches, and we really haven't had a ton of recovery since then. So, another few things I'd like to highlight from 2018 is north aspects and lower elevations was certainly favored. That's where we were seeing larger mortality events, and just something to keep our eyes on. The other thing that was a little bit fascinating in 2018 was, a browning in the juniper. I think we've since see that live out a little bit, particularly in Southeast Utah, and less so in Colorado, is just the crown density dropping. If you travel just west over into Bears Ears from the area of my focus here, there's a noticeable defoliation occurring in juniper. So another thing that we're watching closely, but not to the scale as other other areas nearby. So here's a shot from 2 weeks ago out in Canyons, the Ancients National Monument. We've got a decent die-off observed here. So far, we do have sage beneath it, and there was almost no cheatgrass in this area. So that's encouraging, and we're going to continue to observe this process. Something we've also been keeping a close eye on is fire. In the Four Corners, we haven't seen it in a ton of large fires in pinyon junipers, but there have been some big ones. And the early 2000s or numerous fires in Mesa Verde National Park. We've also had a number of fires across the field office here. Typically, the size is the main concern in terms of recruitment for pinyon juniper as a management perspective. Just without having a seed source close by, a lot of the larger fires we have zero recruitment within, whereas the smaller 200 acres or less, great recruitment, but it's a longer process. So that's something we're keeping an eye on, and I'd say is a little different than elsewhere in the Great Basin. We haven't observed the large scale conversion to cheatgrass, to annual invasives. The cheatgrass in the Four Corners, it seems like it's more cycle dependent. So when do we get moisture and how much moisture? If we get more moisture in late spring, we're going to have a banner cheatgrass crop year versus if we don't. So more information needed there, but we've had also really great responses of natives. So that's encouraging. I know elsewhere that's not the case. So we're counting our blessings on that front. So of course, all agencies are managing for multiple objectives. So we've got to balance infrastructure, cultural resources, vegetation, wildlife, and recreation. Here's a picture from Canyons and Ancients of a little bit of protection done for some sensitive cultural sites that both vegetation and fire would damage the site. So while predominantly there's not much fuels work occurring in the monument itself, the limited amount is focused on either riparian restoration or on protecting sensitive cultural resources. So that applies to fire management as well. The entire monument has a protection emphasis. That said, if the protection action itself is going to damage the resource we're trying to protect, it is we try to shy away from that. So that's retardant usage, line placement, and close coordination with archaeologists during fire suppression incidents. The other picture down here is just the fact that we've got an expanding wildland urban interface. It's as Pinyonjuniper either contract or expand, population certainly seems to be expanding. So that's presenting a challenge and a lot of pressure on managers to treat more, to thin more, to burn more, to insert your choice of treatment. So how do we manage for a resilient ecosystem? Most of these slides are really just for me to remember what I want to talk about. Really fine tuning our objectives. Is this a WUI area? Is it an area where we have critical infrastructure that we need to buffer and protect? Are we managing for veg? Is this an area where we could design a treatment to enhance some sort of vegetation desired outcome? And or are we managing for a threatened endangered species? We have areas on the field office where we've managed to limit conifer expansion into sage grouse habitat. So those are things we have to juggle, and ideally that these will overlay with each other, but not always. And I think we need to be realistic and have eyes wide open on what our objective is, and before we design a project. So treatment type and selection, we've shifted towards trying to maintain a full toolbox when we go into any veg management project, just to give us the flexibility to use the appropriate tool when required. So a hand thin versus a mastication, a prescribed fire versus nothing. So that's been the more recent strategy. Typically, we would probably just mechanically treat everything. At least we did in the mid 2000s. The Four Corners, especially this field office, had expansive fuels treatments, and we've evolved from that perspective. Though the bull hog masticator did leave us with a lot of really great treatments, it also had some undesired outcomes. And then timing, I think that's a big lesson learned from the really the last 15 years is if you are doing a treatment for infrastructure protection, the timing of it can be really important. We don't want to design a thinning in pinyon juniper that then brings in or encourages the Ips beetle that's already present in the area to further spread into the trees that we're not removing. So timing has been a big lesson learned to the field, is just trying to schedule in the winter. That timing also goes into the next one is soil disturbance and then veg response. We'd like to not encourage invasives, and the more soil we've disturbed, and when we do this disturbing seems to play a role into that. So we try to, if possible, time the treatments to be late fall, winter, ground's frozen, and less impacts with the Ips beetle, and also to any invasive grasses. So monitoring, we never really seem to be able to do enough of this, but we're certainly trying. I can tell you that we're taking a really hard look at past treatments, even though there's pressure to retreat areas, is to really get out in the field and assess the validity of the need. So does the fuels treatment still meet the fuels objective of altering fire behavior? Will it break up a crown fire as it approaches infrastructure, or does it justify retreatment? So through that, we've extended our planning timeframes. One of the EAs I completed recently before leaving the position, we gave ourselves 20 years for veg management, and that's really just so that we get it right and not force it. So if you put yourselves on a typical time frame, which would be 10 years, we may not have the ideal conditions for that veg treatment, and then budget constraints and target pressure could play a factor on managers. So that's been that was a little bit of a new shift that we've gone with. We didn't get a ton of pushback that we were trying to do anything other than be open to input, but that it would just give us a little more wiggle room to actually do good out there. And then the last line is just partnering with researchers. We've got Dr. Redmond's been working down on the field office a bit. As a state office guy, I'll give the big push that we're certainly interested in entertaining some further opportunities, especially if they could be in coordination with treatments to help advise the field. I think that's the only way that we're really going to confront all this change and not set us up for failure. Let's see. Okay, so here's just a picture of a recent hand thinning. This is an area where we easily could have gotten a masticator, but it was determined that we didn't really want to cause the soil disturbance. We also wanted to be a little more precise. This picture doesn't show it great, but it was a prescription that favored uneven stand and et cetera, et cetera. So there was some thought and more of a silvicultural emphasis on this Pinyonjuniper woodland. We certainly could use more input to this area and and that's an area I could see a lot of improvement in terms of prescription development moving forward. That would be great. I think another point here is that we don't have a desired end state. I know when I came up in fuels and project design, there was sort of standard spacing based elements, and we're trying to really use some other tools, remote sensing and some different ideas to help advise what, different successional class areas, what age class of what species are we at a deficit of, or do we have a surplus of? So those are all being pulled in. And then here's just a shot from right around Cortez of previous management action. This is a bullhog masticator treatment from the mid 2000s, and does this still meet the fuels perspective, fuels need objective, which I believe it does. Are we seeing good recruitment here? Not so much in this exact this plot, but do we have good native grass cover, et cetera? And then with that, that's the ammunition we need to resist the push from either the public or lawmakers to do something in areas where we really don't need to be doing anything. So that's another thing in the toolbox is the none option for treatment. Oh, there's actually questions in chat. Great. So I would also say have patience. Any practitioners on here, we're still waiting for more research, and also sometimes there's a little bit of a lag, and we need to wait a few years to see some beneficial effects to some of these PJ treatments, because maybe the year after it we won't see native grass, but it was a really dry year, and then the following year we will. So you can have a little patience, wait before putting seed in there, and continue to monitor. So there, my contact info is there. I actually should throw my email in the chat here, but hopefully that was a decent enough really dashboard cruise into management. I did see some questions in there. So the first one was, how successful have we been in prescribed fire and treatments areas? And which landscapes is fire prioritized? So we are just getting into prescribed fire in PJ, I think is the answer. We've got some bigger projects that have that as an element. So it's unknown yet, I guess, is the answer. And then the areas that we're really focusing on are as high up as we can get in terms of elevation. All the treatments that we've had any negative impacts have .gov have been down low. So and I think that is kind of common sense, but it that's really elevation that R&R value just increases, and it's much less problematic.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, and let's see, we have plenty of time for questions. So there was another one about if you consider pinyon jays as well as sagegrass in your treatment objectives.
We do. I guess I should back up. That has not come up in any analysis, any of the EAs recently, the pinyon jay. I think it's worth pointing out that the scale of treatment in this area is significantly smaller than in the Great Basin. This field office in particular, maybe 2,000 acres a year, and that's not in Pinyonjuniper necessarily. I would say 3/4 is in their limited ponderosa pine where they're burning. So it's just not yet a factor, but I've heard a lot about Pinyonjuniper is coming, and it's going to be folded into the BLM considerably more in the near future.
Great, thank you. All right, well, Peter, if you want to turn on your camera too, we'll just start back up from the top so I can keep track of all the questions. But the first one was, what are dieback trends, or maybe this is for both of you, what are dieback trends since 2016?
So in our region, at least my lab hasn't had a project to quantify that. My personal observations would be that it's intensifying. The photo behind me shows just the hills above Reno, where I walk my dog, and every year I'm kind of on it. I see what's happening. I see the sawflies come. I see, but it's really intensifying in the northwestern part of single-leaf pinyon pine range. In central Nevada. It's not everywhere, and the patches aren't huge. The scale of them tends to be something like what I'm showing in the background here. But a lot of low elevation areas. I noticed in the pine nuts at the low elevations, there's just it looks like this, where the junipers are green and really pop out because they're what's left, and the pinyon pines turn gray, but yeah, we don't have it quantified, but just personal anecdote and observation, I would say it's intensified, as one would expect, in the same kinds of sites.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you're seeing too, Ian?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we don't have it quantified if Peter doesn't, but I think I foresee us, this next year seeing an even larger amount. I'm just not sure how we don't. 2018 it was bigger than we'd seen, in 12 and 13. So I think we're going to see compounding effects.
Thanks. The next question, is there data on fruiting comparison in PJ?
So okay, a lot of that data comes from Pinus edulis and more Ian's part of the world. There have been limited studies with single-leaf pinyon pine cone production and seed production. So there are comparisons. Generally, there's been a decline in seed production, also associated with. Is Miranda Redmond here? She's not. I don't think so. So she'd be the person, to ask for that. But really, the kinds of drought conditions and hot summers and warmer winters have lent themselves to a lot of aborted cones. So there's cone production, but then since it's an 18-month cone production cycle, the cones tend to abort before they produce seed. So I'm not sure if that's what the question is getting at. There are studies, there are data. It's more for Pinus edulis.
Okay, well, if you need more clarification on that question, please type in some more. The next question, Peter, what opportunities might there be to use your research to identify sites that are likely to experience drought mortality in the future, and thus where vegetation treatments should be avoided or done more carefully?
I think so. Besides, we've modeled, and probably other researchers out there too have modeled areas of dieback associated with climate variables and topographic positions, and so we have predictive models, that should be confronted with reality as the years go on, and we see where die-off happens, and those models improved. It would be interesting also to compare those models with the outcomes of management on those different sites, because those are two different questions, really. Where are we more likely to see die-off, and where are we more likely to see a positive or a negative or some different kind of management response? So again, as Ian was talking about researchers working with managers in this adaptive management context, that's where we learn something. I feel that that's an important direction to go in the context of landscape prioritization of different kinds of treatments in different environmental settings.
Are you guys working towards that? Is there a group working on that? I guess I should ask.
Always talking to people about it and working towards it. So informally, I'd say yes, though. Yeah, but we're getting there.
Okay, good. Thank you. Next question, could Peter Weisberg show the slide again with the 2 columns, wetter sites and dry sites? But I don't know if there was a question associated with it. They just wanted to see it, but that's fine.
We could give it a try.
Okay.
Is it this one, the drought resistance summary, or the, well, that's one with columns, or not the one with graphs? So is it this one?
I'm guessing it was the one right before it with the green and red, because I thought it looked like Christmas trees because, you know, it's the holidays are coming.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that one is what I'm guessing.
Unintended, but
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
Okay, great. Okay, I don't know if there's a question to go along with it, but we'll just leave it up on the slide while I continue with the questions. Okay, have we found a way to utilize biomass from treatments to the benefit of the desired ecological outcomes? Oh, have we found a way to utilize biomass from treatments to the benefit of the desired outcomes?
I can say that we have. We certainly offer that up locally as firewood products, and it's utilized quite a bit.
That's great.
We've even used targeted Christmas tree harvest for some conifer encroachment management for sage grouse within sage grouse habitat. So we're trying different avenues again outside of a commercial utilization. It's hard to get to the scale needed.
And I know someone, I don't know if it's in here, but someone had a question about, do you leave the trees, the dead trees where they are? But when you showed the slide about, it depends on your objectives for that. Does it just depend, whether you leave the trees depends on the objectives for the site?
Yeah, it does. And you know, I'll say on the monument, we don't have any firewood harvesting permitted. So there's limited grazing, there's limited, you know, harvesting of any products. So that's a better control site for the natural, you know, the net change, observing climate change and expansion or contraction.
Great, thanks. Let's see, given that PJ is not as fire resistant as ponderosa pine, is tree mortality from prescribed fire considered in the overall prescription for tree removal?
It certainly is. You know, we've had some of the recent projects that are underway and not yet really completed, but have just begun. You know, the removal method for Pinyonjuniper is going to be fire in chunks. And I think there's another question about moving away from mastication and why. It just depends. You know, the mid 2000s or mid aughts, the BLM went really hard after mastication, and it's not that we're completely over it. It's just that we've sort of done that in a lot of places, and now that if we're further out and we have the ability, we'd like to use a natural process to induce mortality instead of a machine.
Great. Let's see, management support studies, program funding announcement. Oh, maybe that's just a funding announcement for everyone. Okay, thanks, Zachary. Okay, for Peter, based on your research, can you elaborate on what silvicultural practices might look like for managers interested in promoting health and resilience of pinyons in particular?
That's a good question. So I think Ian showed a slide with a good example there, you know, which was a thinning treatment that wasn't thinning to uniformity, was informed using remote sensing with the goal of uneven age management. You know, Ian mentioned maintaining different components of the age structures, the different ages and sizes of trees. It seems that, you know, with Pinyonjuniper, there hasn't been as much development of silviculture for purposes of maintaining forest health as we see it in other Western forest types. The focus has been more on how to reduce its cover. So I think the kind of work that the kind of practices that Ian was showing and that I know others have implemented, largely, maybe some of it in the Great Basin, but much of it in Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico, efforts towards uneven age management of Pinyonjuniper woodlands. More such projects with monitoring, so we can learn what really works through future drought events to see how woodland health is affected. So I guess that's where I view that's what I view as a positive direction there.
Great, thank you. Time just is like sneaking up on me today. But there's about 5 more questions. Do you two have time to stay on to answer the rest of the questions, or do you, Peter?
This is the most important thing I'm doing today.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks guys. All right. Okay, given the effect of tree density on drought mortality risk and fire risk, what are your thoughts about the existing management regime of large scale removal versus potentially attempting thinning treatments over larger areas for enhancing long-term resilience? Kind of sounds like it's similar to maintaining forest health that you were just talking about.
Yeah, though there was a fire risk component of that question.
Yeah.
Curious what Ian thinks about that.
Well, I'm a huge fan of it. I think that could be maybe some of the tricks to retaining Pinyonjuniper into the future is thinning. As long as it meets that fire, reducing fire risk objective. I guess I didn't add this on about why I shy away from mastication is it just orients the fuel differently, so it doesn't remove it. So, if we're gonna go into thinning, I'd like to see it in a cut and pile and burn or a cut and remove scenario. If we pile and burn, we should typically seed as well. But in terms of fire perspective, I'd like to, get that out of there. It's also not really done all that much, and I know that some field offices are pursuing thinning treatments, and that kind of is cutting edge. So,
yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Peter?
Well, I'm curious what you think, Ian, about thinning to uniformity, because I've seen thinning treatments in PJ that are more fire risk reduction focused, and they're often thinning to uniformity, maybe even some pruning, removal of lower branches. And just really, you could tell that fire risk reduction is the purpose, But how do you feel about those treatments as opposed to other kinds of thinning treatments in terms of satisfying that objective?
it works, but it is painful to watch. Is how I would say that. We see a lot of lollipops in the interface. I think we could get the same results with more of a natural stand structure in terms of reducing that crown fire potential without it just looking, I'm just going to say it's silly.
Yeah, my impression too.
Thank you both. Ian, what were the main issues you saw that supported your office region shying away from using mastication as a primary tool? Oh, I think you just answered that. Just that it just changed the.
I think, we've touched on that one.
Okay, great. Who was it that Peter mentioned doing seed fruit production?
Miranda Redmond, Colorado State University.
Okay. Thank you for typing that in. Great. Okay. A lot of people commented about seeing less fruit and about die-off. Is there a way to map only pinyon pine across the West?
So the technology keeps getting better. We haven't been successful doing that. We haven't tried it at the scale of UAVs, drones. There's just all kinds of improved cameras now and sensors that you can fly. So I don't want to say it's impossible, but I haven't seen it or heard about it, and it seems like a daunting task. As surprising as that seems, given that when you look out on the landscape with our eyes, we're able to do the feature extraction and pull out the junipers from the pinyons based on their slight differences in color and texture, but it seems pretty challenging to pull out with remote sensing. But I'm sure that somebody will come out with an approach that works sooner or later.
Technological advancements. For Peter, regarding prioritizing treatment sites, given that wetter sites on north and east facing aspects are surviving better regardless of density, should we actually consider avoiding treatments in these areas and potentially focus on treatments on the drier sites where trees may die anyway, and where density may be more important for tree survival?
Okay, a couple of comments there. One is that it depends on our management objectives. If our management objective is to maintain tree dominance in that site, manage it as a woodland site, and we're managing it for drought resilience and forest health, then that is what I was getting at, prioritizing those kinds of treatments in the drier sites. But that's just based on our one study having shown greater effects of density on drier sites. More people need to study it in more places. And I'd hate to see a one-size-all kind of prescription across broad landscapes where we only treat those kinds of areas that way. So that's kind of what I was edging towards based on our results, but it is just one study.
Great, thanks. Another person asked, once they get down, this is a continuation from a different question, but once the trees get down to holding just 1 or 2 years of needles, do you think there is widespread loss of ability to recover vigor, even if the climate gets wetter?
So we did look at, for our resampling study, the field study that I presented, we looked at whether trees which had lost canopy, which had thin crowns in 2005 were more likely to be dead in 2015, and the answer was yes. I don't think I have that figure in my extra slide. So yeah, it suggests that the ability to recover following loss of previous year's needle cohorts is reduced. I'm trying to think if I know of any ecophysiological studies that have really looked at that. There might be some, but we haven't looked at the mechanisms. So the suggestion from the work that I know about is that recovery is less likely in subsequent wet years. But the exact point at which, if you have a good wet year, you won't see those trees come back, it's hard to say. And when you do look at old growth pinyon pines, they have a very patchy crown. You could tell from their growth form that they've experienced previous drought events, lost crown, and then recovered with a certain structure. So there's certainly some ability to recover.
Thank you. Some research in New Mexico suggests that thinning may reduce vigor or survival of remaining pinyon pines, counter to what we've been talking about. So I think a lot more research and adaptive management needs to occur. Do you have any comment on that?
Agree.
Okay. Great. Then the last one, it looks like, I gather oak are not significant species in your PJ.
Not in my Ian's, they probably are.
It is, especially on as you move up in elevation. Yep, they'll be intermingled, and that may be, I think this is a response to some comments on mastication. That may be where we would use mastication, or even more likely prescribed fire. That's where we're getting in from, going from PJ mixed mountain shrub up into our ponderosa, and we're likely to try to bring fire down through that.
Great. Thank you. Well, that was the last question. Thank you both. A lot of great questions and good information. Thank you all for your participation, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey that will appear after I close the webinar. This recording will be posted on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel within the next few days, and the link will be automatically sent to you through a Zoom webinar follow-up email. Tomorrow's webinars are on fire impacts in pinyon-juniper woodlands, recovery, plant invasions, and restoration opportunities by Ali Urza, and anticipating future climate-driven changes in pinyon-juniper woodlands by Bob Schreiber. If you have further questions regarding today's or other webinars, both Ian and Peter gave you their email addresses, and you're always welcome to email me or call me for follow-up as well. Thank you all so much for attending this webinar, and thank you so much, Peter and Ian, for presenting. That was great. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.